In 2015, a young pastor named Mark Henderson stood before a crowd of 300 people in a rented movie theater in suburban Dallas. The worship band had just finished playing, the lights were perfectly dimmed, and the air crackled with that unmistakable energy of something new beginning. Mark had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. He'd raised $200,000, assembled a team of 12 volunteers, designed a logo that looked like it belonged on a coffee shop in Brooklyn, and crafted a vision statement about reaching the unchurched millennials of North Texas. 642 days later, that church no longer existed. The money was gone. The volunteers had scattered, and Mark Henderson was working at a car dealership, wondering what went wrong. His story is not unique. In fact, it's so common that researchers have given it a name, church planter attrition, and the numbers are staggering. According to data compiled by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability and various denominational studies, somewhere between 60 and 80% of new churches in America fail within the first 5 years. Some estimates push that number even higher. The Southern Baptist Convention, which tracks church planting more rigorously than most denominations, reported that of the churches they helped plant between 2008 and 2013, nearly half were no longer functioning by 2018. Lifeway research found that approximately 4,000 churches close their doors every single year in the United States, while only about 3,000 new ones open. That means the country experiences a net loss of roughly 1,000 churches annually. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Despite these grim statistics, church planting has become one of the most popular movements in American Christianity over the past 3 decades. It spawned its own industry, complete with conferences, coaching networks, assessment centers, and venture capital-style funding models. There are now organizations that function essentially as church startup incubators, promising to help pastors launch successful congregations, the way Y Combinator helps entrepreneurs launch tech companies. So, what's actually happening? Why do so many churches fail? And perhaps more importantly, why do people keep starting them despite the odds? Welcome to Professor Archive. Before we go any further, I want to know something about you. Drop a comment and tell me what you do for a living and where you're watching from right now. I'm genuinely curious about the community we're building here. And if you find this kind of deep dive valuable, consider hitting that subscribe button or even leaving a super thanks. It really does help us keep making content like this. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The modern church planting movement didn't emerge from a vacuum. Its roots stretch back to the 1970s and the emergence of what historians call the church growth movement, pioneered largely by a Fuller Theological Seminary professor named Donald McGavran. McGavran had spent decades as a missionary in India, and he became obsessed with a simple question: why do some churches grow while others stagnate? He applied social science research methods to religious communities and developed principles he believed could predict and produce church growth. His most influential and controversial idea was called the homogeneous unit principle. McGavran argued that churches grow fastest when they target specific demographic groups. People, he observed, prefer to worship with others who look like them, talk like them, and share their cultural background. This wasn't a moral judgment, McGavran insisted. It was simply a sociological observation, and it fundamentally changed how church leaders thought about starting new congregations. By the 1980s, McGavran's ideas had merged with the rise of the megachurch. These massive congregations, many of them in suburban areas, demonstrated that churches could function like corporations, complete with professional marketing, slick production values, and CEO-style pastoral leadership. Willow Creek Community Church outside Chicago became the model. Founded by Bill Hybels in 1975, it grew to over 20,000 weekly attendees by the 1990s. Saddleback Church in Southern California, led by Rick Warren, followed a similar trajectory. What's crucial to understand is that these megachurches didn't just grow. They reproduced. They developed systems, curricula, and conferences designed to teach other pastors how to replicate their success. The assumption was straightforward: if it works here, it can work anywhere. You just need the right formula. This is where the church startup phenomenon really accelerated. In 1999, a group called the Association of Related Churches was founded with an explicit mission to plant life-giving churches. Better known as ARC, this organization became perhaps the most influential church planting network in American evangelical Christianity. Their model was sophisticated. Potential church planters went through intensive assessment processes. They were trained in leadership, fundraising, and organizational management. They were given launch teams, funding support, and ongoing coaching. ARC churches typically launched with significant resources, often in the range of $200,000 to $500,000 in startup capital. The results, at least initially, seemed remarkable. ARC planted churches reported higher survival rates than the broader average. They launched bigger, they grew faster. By 2020, ARC had helped plant over 1,000 churches. But critics began to notice something troubling. The churches that thrived tended to follow an extremely narrow template. They had contemporary worship, charismatic leadership, and they targeted the same demographic: young, suburban, middle to upper middle class families. The question emerged, were they really planting diverse, sustainable communities of faith, or were they franchising a religious product? This tension sits at the heart of the church startup phenomenon. Let me tell you about a pastor named Darren Patrick. His story illustrates both the promise and the peril of this movement. Patrick founded the Journey Church in St. Louis in 2002. Within a decade, it had grown to over 4,000 members across multiple campuses. Patrick became a national figure in evangelical circles, serving as vice president of the Acts 29 Network, another major church planting organization. He wrote books, he spoke at conferences, he was held up as a model of what successful church planting looked like. Then, in 2016, the Journey's elders removed Patrick from his position, citing a pattern of what they called sinful actions that disqualified him from further ministry at the Journey. The specifics were never fully detailed publicly, but the removal shocked the church planting world. Here was one of their most prominent success stories, suddenly exposed as something far more complicated. Patrick's story took an even more tragic turn. In May 2020, he died by suicide at the age of 49. His death prompted a painful reckoning within church planting circles. How much pressure were they putting on pastors? Was the emphasis on growth and success creating environments where leaders felt they couldn't be honest about their struggles? Were they building churches on the foundation of charismatic individuals rather than sustainable community structures? The data suggests these questions point to something real. A study by the Francis A. Schaeffer Institute found that 70% of pastors constantly fight depression, and 90% reported that ministry was harder than they anticipated when they started. The Barna Group has consistently found that pastoral burnout is at epidemic levels, with roughly 40% of pastors considering leaving ministry in the past year. For church planters specifically, these numbers are often worse because they carry the unique burden of starting something from nothing. But pastoral burnout is only one piece of the puzzle. Many churches fail not because their pastors burn out, but because they never gain traction in the first place. Consider the economics. According to a Hartford Institute for Religion Research study, the median annual income for a church in America is about $120,000. But launching a new church typically requires significant upfront investment. You need space. You need equipment. You need marketing. You need staff, even if it's minimal. You need to support the pastor's salary during a period when there may be few or no tithers. Most church planting experts recommend having at least 1 to 2 years of operating expenses in the bank before launching. For many new churches, that means having access to $200,000 or more. Where does this money come from? Some denominations provide direct funding. The Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, channels millions of dollars annually into church planting through its North American Mission Board. But denominational support has limits and often comes with strings attached. Many church planters turn to fundraising, essentially asking existing churches and individual donors to invest in their vision. This creates a peculiar dynamic. Pastors who might be excellent at preaching and pastoral care find themselves spending months or years essentially working as nonprofit fundraisers. And here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The churches most likely to provide funding for new church plants are themselves large, well-resourced congregations. This means new churches often launch with implicit or explicit expectations that they'll eventually look like their funders. The model perpetuates itself. Let me take you inside a church plant launch for a moment. The typical approach today is called a large group launch. The goal is to gather as many people as possible for that first public service. Church planters are coached to build a core team for months or even years before launching. They hold preview services to build buzz. They pour resources into marketing, mailers, social media ads, community events. The hope is to hit the ground, running with a congregation that looks and feels established from day one. Why this approach? Because conventional wisdom holds that people are more likely to return to a church that already feels successful. Nobody wants to be part of something that looks like it's struggling. This creates a peculiar chicken and egg problem. You need to look successful to attract people, but you need people to actually be successful. The pressure this creates is immense. I spoke with a church planter in Phoenix who described his launch Sunday as the most terrifying day of his life. He told supporters he expected 300 people. 450 showed up. By week 4, attendance had dropped to 180. By month 6, it was 90. The church survived, but he described those first 2 years as living in constant anxiety. Watching the numbers, second-guessing every decision, wondering if this week would be the one when everything fell apart. The numerical obsession in church planting culture deserves examination. Every major church planting network tracks attendance closely. Launch numbers, average weekly attendance, giving per capita, year-over-year growth. These metrics determine which church planters get invited to speak at conferences, which ones receive additional funding, which ones are held up as models to emulate. Critics argue this creates a fundamentally distorted picture of what church success should mean. Eugene Peterson, the late pastor and author who wrote the Message translation of the Bible, was famously skeptical of the church growth movement. He once wrote that pastors have been co-opted by the culture's definition of success and had become more like shopkeepers than shepherds. His critique resonated with many who felt that the church startup model prioritized entrepreneurial skills over spiritual depth. But defenders counter that numbers matter because people matter. Every additional person in a congregation represents a soul being reached, a life potentially transformed. And there's something to be said for taking seriously the organizational and leadership challenges of building sustainable religious communities. The theological diversity of church planting adds another layer of complexity. Not all church plants emerge from the same tradition or carry the same assumptions. Mainline Protestant denominations like the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Methodist Church, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America have their own church planting initiatives, though these receive far less attention than their evangelical counterparts. Their approach tends to be slower, more modest in scale, and more focused on neighborhood integration than rapid growth. The Catholic Church doesn't really do church planting in the Protestant sense, since parishes are established by bishops according to geographical need. But the growth of Hispanic Catholic communities has led to the creation of new missions and parishes, particularly in the South and Southwest. Orthodox Christian communities have also experienced growth in America, with new parishes being established, though their model emphasizes liturgical tradition rather than contemporary relevance. And then there are the independent churches, accountable to no denomination, often built entirely around a single charismatic leader. These represent perhaps the highest risk category of church plants. Without denominational oversight, accountability structures are weak or non-existent. When things go wrong, they can go very wrong indeed. The stories of independent church plants imploding are grimly familiar. Mars Hill Church in Seattle, led by Mark Driscoll, grew to 15,000 members before collapsing spectacularly in 2014 amid accusations of plagiarism, bullying, and misuse of church funds. Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago, led by James McDonald, followed a similar trajectory, dissolving its membership after McDonald was removed for conduct, described as sinful and harmful. In both cases, the churches had been held up as models of successful church planting. Their failures revealed how quickly apparent success can mask serious dysfunction. Here's something fascinating about the geography of church planting. It's not evenly distributed. The majority of new church plants in America cluster in a few predictable locations. Fast-growing suburban areas, particularly in the Sun Belt. Texas receives more church plants than almost any other state. The suburbs of Atlanta, Phoenix, Denver, and Charlotte are saturated with new congregations. This makes demographic sense. These areas have growing populations, many of them young families looking for community institutions to join. But this geographic concentration creates problems. It means that many church plants are essentially competing with each other for the same pool of potential members. In some suburban communities, you can find multiple nearly identical churches within a few miles of each other. Same worship style, same demographic target, same aesthetic. They're not reaching the unchurched so much as shuffling already church people between congregations. Meanwhile, areas of actual religious decline receive far fewer church planting resources. New England, the Pacific Northwest, and urban centers outside the South see relatively little church planting activity. The reasons are obvious. These areas are harder. The cultural headwinds are stronger. The potential for rapid growth is lower. But if the goal of church planting is genuinely to bring faith to places where it's absent, the current distribution of effort seems misaligned. There's a term used in church planting circles that captures something important: transfer growth versus conversion growth. Transfer growth means your church is growing because Christians from other churches are joining. Conversion growth means people who weren't previously Christians are becoming believers. Most church planters claim to prioritize conversion growth. But study after study suggests that transfer growth accounts for the majority of attendees in new churches. This isn't necessarily a failure. People have legitimate reasons to seek out new congregations: relocating to a new city, experiencing conflict at a previous church, finding a community that better fits their life stage. But it does complicate the narrative that church planting is primarily an evangelistic enterprise. In many cases, it's more accurate to say it's a reshuffling enterprise. Let me tell you about the international dimension, because church planting in America doesn't exist in isolation. Some of the fastest growing churches in the United States are actually extensions of movements that originated elsewhere. Hillsong, which began in Australia, planted a campus in New York City in 2010 that quickly became one of the most talked about churches in America, drawing celebrities and media attention. Redeemer City to City, an organization founded by Tim Keller in New York, has helped plant churches not just across the United States but around the world, adapting its approach to different cultural contexts. Meanwhile, American church planting organizations have exported their models globally. ARC has planted churches across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Acts 29 operates on every continent. The assumption underlying this global expansion is that American-developed church planting techniques are universally applicable, an assumption that deserves scrutiny. In some contexts, American-style church plants have succeeded dramatically. In others, they've been criticized as a form of cultural imperialism, imposing Western worship styles and leadership structures on communities with their own rich religious traditions. Now, let's talk about what actually predicts whether a church plant will survive. The research here is surprisingly consistent. Several factors emerge repeatedly as predictors of church plant viability. First, the church planter's spouse. Studies have found that pastoral marriages under stress are one of the strongest predictors of church plant failure. The demands of starting a new church are so intense that without a supportive and resilient partner, many pastors simply can't sustain the effort. This raises uncomfortable questions about what church planting culture asks of pastoral families. Second, the presence of a strong core team before launch. Churches that launch with fewer than 50 committed adults in the core team fail at significantly higher rates than those with larger founding groups. This seems obvious in retrospect. You need a critical mass of people to do the work of building something new. Third, the planter's age and experience. Counterintuitively, younger planters don't necessarily do better. Some research suggests that pastors in their mid-30s to mid-40s, with at least a decade of ministry experience, have better outcomes than those in their 20s who are launching straight out of seminary. Fourth, location selection. Churches planted in areas with genuine population growth and limited church density have better odds. Churches planted in already saturated religious markets struggle. Fifth, financial sustainability planning. Churches that think seriously from the beginning about how they'll achieve financial independence fare better than those focused primarily on the launch. What's notable about this list is how practical it is. Success in church planting isn't primarily about theological correctness or charismatic leadership or worship style. It's about the blocking and tackling of organizational development. But here's where things get interesting. Even when churches do everything right by conventional measures, many still fail. And some that seem to violate every principle somehow thrive. Consider the house church movement. Over the past 2 decades, a quiet counter-movement has emerged among Christians disillusioned with the megachurch model. These believers gather in homes, without professional pastors, without elaborate programming, without any of the infrastructure that church planting organizations insist is essential. They're nearly impossible to count since they often don't register as formal organizations. But researchers estimate that millions of Americans now participate in some form of house church or simple church network. Are these successes or failures by conventional metrics? They're certainly not growing into large institutions. They're not planting more churches in the traditional sense. But their participants often report deeper relationships, more meaningful spiritual practices, and freedom from the consumeristic dynamics of contemporary church culture. The question of what counts as success haunts the church planning conversation. If a church launches with 200 people, peaks at 400, then gradually declines to 75 over a decade, was it a failure? It existed for 10 years. Presumably lives were touched, marriages performed, children raised in faith, funerals conducted, community built. The metrics would show a church in decline. The human reality might be far more complex. This is where the startup analogy breaks down. Venture capitalists evaluate startups based on growth and return on investment. A company that levels off at modest size might be a perfectly fine business, but it's not what investors want. The language of church startups imports these assumptions into religious contexts where they may not belong, and religious communities have existed for thousands of years without anything resembling modern growth metrics. The early church didn't have attendance tracking software or giving dashboards. Monasteries endured for centuries with populations in the dozens. The Amish have maintained their way of life for generations without any interest in rapid expansion. The assumption that a healthy church must always be growing is, historically speaking, rather novel. Yet there's also something to be said for the ambition and energy of the church planting movement. At its best, it represents genuine entrepreneurial faith, people willing to take risks, sacrifice comfort, and pour themselves into building something new. The fact that most attempts fail doesn't necessarily mean the attempts are misguided. Most new businesses fail too. That doesn't make entrepreneurship foolish. The emotional toll on church planters whose efforts don't succeed is severe. Many describe feelings of shame, grief, and spiritual crisis. Their identities were wrapped up in the church they were building. When the church fails, it can feel like they have failed not just organizationally, but spiritually, even morally. The support systems for failed church planters are remarkably thin. Denominations and networks tend to focus resources on success stories, not casualties. In recent years, some organizations have begun addressing this. There are now retreats, counseling resources, and peer support groups specifically for church planters who have experienced failure or burnout. But these remain underfunded and underutilized compared to the resources devoted to launching new efforts. What happens to churches that don't quite fail but don't really succeed? The technical term is stuck. These are congregations that plateau at a size too small to afford full-time professional leadership, too large to function as an intimate house church, perpetually struggling to maintain programming expectations established during more optimistic days. According to various estimates, roughly half of all American churches fall into this category. Not growing, not dying, just enduring. Some researchers argue that stuck churches represent a kind of success, albeit modest. They provide stable community for their members. They persist. In an era of religious decline, mere persistence is an achievement. Others see stuck churches as slow-motion failures, consuming resources and pastoral energy without accomplishing the growth that justifies their existence in the church planting paradigm. As I've researched this topic, I've been struck by how much the conversation about church planting mirrors broader cultural conversations about success, failure, growth, and meaning. American culture celebrates founders, startup founders, movement founders, church founders. We tell stories about visionaries who built something from nothing. We're less interested in stories about people who maintain existing institutions, or who try and fail, or who labor faithfully in obscurity. The church planting movement both reflects and reinforces these cultural values. There's a version of this story that's purely cynical. It would say church planting is just religious entrepreneurship dressed up in spiritual language, ambitious individuals leveraging faith communities for personal platform and financial gain. And certainly examples of that exist. But there's another version that takes seriously the genuine motivations involved. Many church planters are sincere believers who feel called to start new communities. They're willing to sacrifice financial stability and personal comfort for something they believe matters eternally. When their churches fail, they're not just losing a business venture. They're experiencing what feels like spiritual rejection. The truth probably includes both stories and many others besides. So where does this leave us? The church planting movement isn't going anywhere. Despite the high failure rates, new churches will continue to be planted. Networks will continue to train and fund planters. Some will succeed spectacularly. Many will fail. A few will achieve that ambiguous middle ground of modest sustainability. The question for anyone involved in or affected by this movement is what lessons to draw from decades of accumulated experience. Perhaps it's that the startup model has limits when applied to faith communities. Churches aren't products. Spiritual formation isn't scalable in the same way software is. The metrics that make sense for businesses may distort what matters about religious life. Perhaps it's that failure isn't the worst outcome. Churches that launch and close within a few years might still have done genuine good in their brief existence. The obsession with sustainability can obscure this. Perhaps it's that the people involved matter more than the organizational structures. Pastoral health, family well-being, authentic community, these deserve at least as much attention as launch strategies and growth projections. Or perhaps the lesson is simply humility. Building lasting religious community is hard. It's always been hard. The fact that modern techniques and resources haven't dramatically improved success rates suggests that there are dimensions to this work that resist optimization.